There, good evening and a very warm welcome to a very special Herald event for a very special club of subscribers. The Herald, of course, as you'll know, is taking the lead in stimulating serious discourse about Scotland's future. We want to go beyond partisan debate, which, although valid and entirely vital, can sometimes seem sterile. So no more he said, she retorted. Instead, we want to look at depth at the big issues: the economy, taxation, oil, Devomax, health and social care, defence and foreign affairs, and many, many more. And tonight, we start with Brexit and its potential impact upon Scottish independence. Would an independent Scotland seek to rejoin the EU? Would we be welcomed back, or might there be obstacles? If we were readmitted, what would that mean for trade with the rest of the UK, which would, of course, still be outside the European Union? Big questions, huge questions, and we'll tackle them tonight with an expert panel and with searching questions submitted by you, our Herald subscribers. Now, many thanks for the questions, many questions already submitted. We'll try to get to as many of them as possible, but please keep them coming. I want a live debate here. But first, and I've stressed that, please get the questions coming in and add to the ones we have. But let me introduce our panelists in alphabetical order. Let me welcome Graham Avery, independent commentator who has worked as a public servant in London and Brussels. Welcome, Graham. He's a senior advisor at the European Policy Centre in Brussels. Perhaps even more to the point, he was a member of the team who negotiated Britain's original membership of the EC, and he played a key role in other significant European changes, including enlargement to 27 members. Delighted also to welcome Kirsty Hughes. She's been writing and researching on European politics and economics for more than 3 decades. She's a fellow of the Royal Society of Edinburgh and a former director of the Scottish Centre on European Relations. And absolutely delighted as well, and welcome to him, to Philip Rycroft, who was right absolutely at the core of the contentious Brexit process. He probably still wears the scars. He was permanent secretary of the Department for Exiting the EU between 2017 and 2019. Now, each of our panelists, and many thanks to them for this, contributed thoughtful and incisive articles to the Herald series. Before we go to the questions, let's set the scene a little bit. Graham, would you kick us off by setting out your thoughts, please?
Okay, hello everybody. I'd like to say 3 things. First of all, I'm an independent commentator on the Scottish situation. I'm Welsh by origin. I live in England, so I don't have a dog in this race. I have lots of respect for Scotland, where I lived for a few years when I was younger, but I want to insist I'm independent. I'm not the supporter of one side or the other.
Okay.
The reason I got involved in this independence question is that, in 2014, in the first referendum debate, I realized that a lot of people in London were using completely crazy arguments about how it would be so difficult for Scotland, an independent Scotland, to join the European Union. And I think that there are still a lot of completely false arguments which are brandished about that. There's a second thing I want to say, and now this isn't about what I wrote in my piece the other day in the Herald, is that I reckon that once Scotland is independent, it would take something like 3 to 4 years for it to join the European Union. Now, of course, that's not automatic. There are all sorts of processes to go through, but I reckon that's realistic, given that Scotland, after all, was in the European Union for more than 40 years.
Yes.
Before independence, let's not forget this, there will be a period of, I don't know, maybe 1 or 2 years between the referendum and independence, which will be a damn complicated period of negotiation between London and Edinburgh.
Yes.
So I'm not saying it's 3 to 4 years from referendum to independence, but at any rate, 3 to 4 years from independence to accession. The third point I want to say is that the number of questions that need to be negotiated in negotiations to join the European Union by Scotland, they're really quite few. There are some, they're serious, but there's a lot of scare stories. For example, that Scotland would be obliged to join the euro, that Scotland would be obliged to join the Schengen area. No, they're false arguments. In the past, of course, the fishermen and the farmers were quite reluctant to leave the United Kingdom. But now they've seen what Brexit means for farming and fishing. I think many of them reckon they'd have a damn sight better influence on Brussels decisions and on decisions on their own quotas than they do now. Thank you.
Graham, thank you very much indeed. Kirsty, let's come to you. Kirsty, you mentioned in your article that point about the, it's hard to call them hurdles or obstacles, but the issues that have to be surmounted before Scotland could become a member of, an independent Scotland could become a member of the European Union. Give me your take.
Sure, thanks, Brian, and good evening, everybody. I have 3 points too, like Graham, so hopefully not identical ones. I think my top line point is, yes, an independent Scotland could join the European Union, but Scotland's part of that is to apply and meet the technical criteria. But obviously, at the end of the day, it's the EU, it's the 27 member states who get to decide, and it's a political and a technical decision. But having said that, in its lifetime, the EU has allowed 22 member states to join the divided island of Cyprus, the relatively newly divided independent states of the Czech Republic and Slovakia. So I don't see this as, obviously very difficult politically when you look at the whole diverse range of countries that have come in. Mm-hmm. I also think, second point, that some of the most difficult accessions, or ones that haven't happened, like for instance with Turkey, have been when big countries have applied. France's President de Gaulle famously vetoed the UK back in the 1960s, but Scotland will be a small North European country. Chances are it will be quite close to EU laws and regulations still. And it will have had, as I think Graham said, 47 years experience of being inside the EU, albeit not as a state. My last point on the challenges, as Brian mentioned, yes, of course there are going to be big challenges in becoming independent and in joining the EU in some ways. These are all challenges of transition, how you leave the UK, how you set yourself up as an independent state, the choices you make, the things you absolutely have to do, and then how you go about joining the European Union. So I think really we're used to saying, oh, but what about currency? What about borders? Yes. And so on. But actually, if we think, what about transition? How long will it take? What are all the issues in transition? I think we will doubtless talk about borders and so on, but they're not the only issues. Thank you.
Okay. Kirsty, thanks very much indeed. I'm old enough to remember President de Gaulle rather vigorously saying no to UK membership. I'm definitely going to say a big oui to Philip Rycroft, who's joining us next. Philip, thanks very much indeed for joining the discussion. Give us your take, if you'd be so kind.
Yes, thanks, Brian, and good evening, everybody. I am not going to say that Scotland couldn't join the EU. I think Scotland could join the EU. I think the issues, however, will go beyond transition issues. And there's one that I wanted to pick up, which is around the borders. So my view, Brexit, on the one hand, has made independence more likely. That's because Brexit, clearly contrary to the wishes of the majority, a good majority of people in Scotland, has reinforced the sense of Scotland as a separate political community. Independence ultimately is about self-governance, and that derives from the sense of Scotland being a separate political community, reinforced by Brexit. But at the same time, Brexit has made independence for Scotland more complicated, certainly more complicated than it would have been if Scotland had voted yes in 2014, because the UK is no longer in the EU or in the single market. So essentially, Scotland and independent Scotland would have a choice to make as to essentially where it places its trade border. It could seek to stay in the single market with the United Kingdom, or it could seek to join or rejoin the EU and throw its lot in with the EU single market. This is a choice with consequences. 60% of Scottish trade at the moment is with the rest of the UK. That's a higher proportion than UK trade with the EU. And putting a trade border in place between Scotland and the rest of the UK would have consequences, economic consequences, which would be long lasting. So Scotland would have a choice. Does it stick with the trade patterns that it has at the moment by staying in the internal market with the UK, or does it seek to throw in its lot with the EU and join the single market? That is a choice, a difficult choice, but it is essentially an unavoidable choice.
Okay, really interested. I'm going to go to subscriber questions in a second, but Philip, can I just pick up on one thing? I mean, you remind us there that in the 2014 referendum, it was said by those who advocated the union of the UK that the only way for Scotland to stay in the EU was to stay within the United Kingdom. Well, that has proved not to be the case. Is it something of a catch-22 that the Scots were told then you can't leave because the way to stay in, you can't leave the UK because the way to stay in the EU is via England, and now the good and sensible people of England voted from their standpoint to leave the EU, and suddenly Scotland's told, well, you still can't leave the UK. That would you understand the conundrum and the dilemma.
I absolutely understand that, and I personally take no pleasure at all in the way that choice essentially has been foisted on Scotland. But that is the hard reality of the choice that was made essentially by the people of England and Wales to take the United Kingdom out of the EU. And what it revealed, of course, is that the nature of where sovereignty lies in the UK for these sorts of decisions, it lies with the UK Parliament and not with the individual component parts of the United Kingdom. And what Brexit did was to remove the ambiguity from our constitutional construct in a way that demonstrated when push comes to shove, the bigger player, i.e. England, is the one that gets its way.
Okay, I'm really intrigued. Bring in Graham and then Kirsty on a question from David Gow, one of our subscribers. David, thank you very much indeed for your question. He asks, should the Scottish Government and or civic society openly campaign for either rejoining the single market and customs union or full EU membership, or, and this is the key point, are there other ways Scotland could forge ever closer links with mainland Europe and the EU? Does it have to be full membership? Graham, in your view, I think Nicola Sturgeon talked in her conference speech about rejoining the European family of nations, but that doesn't have to be the EU, does it? Graham first, then Kirsty.
Look, I think the alternative you're mentioning is either rejoin the EU or join the EEA. Basically, the EEA is the closest you can be to membership of the European Union without being a member. Yes. Now, it has some advantages, the EEA. Norway's been quite happy there. On the other hand, it has the big disadvantage that you don't have a seat at the table where decisions are taken. Yeah. And I think that is a serious disadvantage. I don't want to go back.
So you take the impact of the rules, but you don't help to draw up those rules in the first place.
Right. I just want to comment that I don't want to go back on the Brexit referendum, but I want to remind everybody that a majority, at least in England, they didn't pay much attention to the economic arguments of Brexit. No. They wanted to take back control. And I think that's quite an important factor for Scots.
Okay. Kirsty, what's your take on this? I mean, the SNP, there's a little bit of signs of a burgeoning debate. Does it have to be full EU membership? Does it have to be full EU membership right away? Might there have to be a further referendum in Scotland? I mean, none of those things are being talked about by the leadership, but they're being talked about within the party. What's your take on this? Would it have to be full EU membership to gain the benefits, as Graham's suggesting?
Well, personally, yes, I think it would have to be full EU membership, and I certainly don't see any sign at the moment of SNP policy or leadership changing on that. I think there's been a long-running debate amongst some people about the European economic area, but it's interesting that David Gow asks about rejoining the single market and customs union, because of course this came up a lot in the Brexit debate. Could we have a super soft Brexit? But of course, no country has ever done that. Turkey is in the EU's customs union. Norway, as Graham said, is in the European Economic Area. But actually, if you joined both, if the EU even agreed that you could join single market and customs union, you'd be even more of a rule taker than if you just joined one. And I think it would be quite extraordinary, actually, to choose independence, to choose self-determination, and then say, you don't want to say in the rules. And just one more point, if I may, you mentioned there is a debate recently, in recent weeks even, around should there be a referendum if Scotland was independent on joining the European Union. I think that would be perfectly sensible when you get to the end of EU negotiations. But what I don't think would be sensible, and some people are advocating, is to make an argument for independence and not say what your European and international relations are going to look like. Because you don't want to do a Brexit and just make it an emotional idea and not say what you think it looks like. And everyone who's pro-independence don't have to say the same thing, but the Scottish Government and SNP would have to say what their European policy looked like. And also in the Brexit debate, I don't think it ever made sense for the UK to be in the single market and customs union without a voice. It would be quite.
This wasn't going to happen. But there's another point as well. Of course, if Brexit is the justification for truncating the timescale for holding Indy Ref 2, then it seems a little bit perverse. So you wouldn't seek to reverse Brexit entirely, but never mind. I'll go to Philip Rycroft, and Philip, I'll bring in a thought from Stan Bromelo, another subscriber. He's pointing out the results of any referendum as evidenced in the 2014 vote and the 2016 Brexit result. He says the results of any further referendum, presumably Indy Ref 2, are likely to be close. How can we hope for an agreed way forward? This is getting to the core of it here, isn't it? Britain's divided, Scotland. There's a core disagreement. Frankly, we don't agree over what Scotland's future or the UK's future should be.
I think it's a great question. It's a very interesting question as well, because most of the time this debate is painted in very primary colours, with people being very certain that if Scotland was independent, it would look like this, and other people saying, no, Scotland's independent, it would look completely different. The truth of the matter, of course, is nobody knows, because let's say Scotland did vote for independence, then the parameters of Scotland's future, including whether and under what terms it would join the EU, would be subject to negotiation. There would be negotiation on the terms by which Scotland became independent, with the government to remain the UK, and there would be an accession negotiation with the EU. So many of the things that are argued now with great passion and with great certainty would actually be subject to that negotiation. And if you go back to 2014, it's very interesting, of course, because at that time, Alex Salmond was saying Scotland is essentially part of 6 unions with the United Kingdom, and we're only talking about leaving one union, which is the political union. So that's sort of demonstrating that independence is a fungible concept. It's not an absolute in any particular direction. And the nature of sovereignty, incidentally, as those who promoted Brexit are now discovering, because the notion that taking back control meant what it said on the tin, that you can do pretty much what you like in international trade, in terms of regulation and standards and so on, is clearly not the case if you want to be part of an international economic community, which the UK, as an open trading nation, clearly does.
Thanks. I've got other questions, but Graham, I saw you smiling broadly at that contribution. Were you tickled by some of the comments? Yes.
Well, what Philip says is always great, but I don't want to go back too much on previous referendums. I want to look a bit forward.
Yeah.
And on that, I want to say, first of all, the other member states of the European Union would welcome Scotland. There's no doubt about that. The so-called Spanish veto is even less valid now than it was in the past, because it wouldn't be a separation of a region of a member state. It would be an independence, and Spain, like all the others, have fully accepted the independence of several states which seceded the last 20 years.
And you've said that will be the case for Scotland, provided the referendum is constitutionally held and internationally recognised.
I think that's very prudent of the Scottish government to insist that it has to be a constitutional process.
Yes.
The other thing I wanted to say, I agree with Philip that the Brexit has made the analysis of Scotland's future more complicated. On the other hand, there are some positives. One is that we know now what Brexit means. That means one of the disasters of Brexit was that nobody knew until Christmas Eve on the day before it happened what the arrangements would be for imports and exports. Well, there will be plenty of time for Scotland and Scottish traders to organise themselves for that. I'm not an economist, but I have to say I'm an optimist. And I can't escape remarking that when Ireland joined the European communities in 1973, it was dependent for 55% of its exports in the United Kingdom. That's now gone down to 10%, and the Irish are richer than the Brits. So I'd like somebody to explain that to me.
I've got a question. Let's go to that. Put it to Philip, perhaps, and then Kirsty. Jean Mary Knowles, thanks for your question, says Republic of Ireland is independent, yet remains part of the common travel area. If Scotland becomes independent, would this option continue to be available, Philip? Certainly the objective of the SNP is that it would.
Yeah, and I, frankly, find it difficult to see the circumstances in which the government of the remainder UK would say no to that, and it would be, I think it would be crazy, frankly, for the government, the rest of the UK, to say to resist a common travel area for Scotland, given the experience we have with Ireland, and because of the Irish precedent, I also think that it would be likely looked on sympathetically by the EU as part of Scotland's accession process. I mean, I speak to you from Scotland. You detect by my accent I'm not Scottish, and like so many other people with family this side and the other side of the border. And even though there would be a trade border, the notion that driving south on the A1 that you would have to show a passport somewhere, I think would just not come to pass. It just self-evidently would be self-defeating for Scotland.
Would there be a trade border? Would there have to be a customs border?
Well, certainly Scotland was joined the EU and as part of the single market, and the remainder of the UK was still outside of the EU and the single market, there would be a trade border. There's no way around that. Okay. And people say, well, maybe you get some arrangement like the Northern Irish Protocol. Yeah. I doubt that, frankly. But even if you did, what's all the fuss about at the moment? The fuss is about the fact that the Northern Irish Protocol requires checks on goods, checks going, in this case, from GB onto the island of Ireland, and that's what the DUP and many others are very exercised about. But that was baked in to the agreement because that gives the ability of the European Union the ability to protect the integrity of the single market, which is, as Graham and Kirsty will say far more eloquently than I will, so central to the European project.
Just briefly, Philip, sticking with that, you mentioned the Northern Ireland Protocol. Do you think it's facing problems, to say the least? It is facing problems. Do you think those problems are remediable, or do you think there is a fundamental flaw in the Northern Ireland Protocol?
No, I've always seen the Northern Ireland Protocol as the least worst of the solutions for trade on the island of Ireland in the context of Brexit. It clearly isn't optimal. Optimal was what was there already. And let's not forget that the premise of the Good Friday Belfast Agreement, by making that border pretty much invisible, was part of getting that agreement signed up and through the system. So it remains hugely important. The Northern Ireland Protocol can be made to work. The European Commission has signalled it is prepared to change the way it's implemented to ease those burdens. Yes. But that will require the UK government to accept that there will continue to have to be checks because that's what it's signed up to. So there is a way forward, but it will require both sides ultimately to compromise.
Face the facts. Okay, I'm going to move you on. If you be kind. Questions.
Just,
Please, Kirsty. Yeah, please.
I mean, just a couple of points. Firstly, I do agree at one level that you would expect an independent Scotland, even in the EU, to join the common travel area. But if you think this is going to be an issue that will come up ahead of the referendum,
yes,
if I was on the unionist side and if I was thinking about tactics, I wouldn't just throw away worries about passport controls between Scotland and England. I might say, well, we're not sure about that, and we'll think about it afterwards, and it will be part of the negotiations.
Yeah, the same sort of thing as was said about the currency in 2014. Exactly the same tactic as was deployed.
Well, I think so.
From a union perspective, entirely legitimately deployed then. Sorry, Kirsty.
I think for the reasons Philip gives, it's unlikely that after a yes vote, the London, rest of UK government would then cut off its nose to spite its face. And not let it happen. But you will. I disagree slightly with something Graham said in his opening remarks, where he said Scotland wouldn't have to join the Schengen area. But both with the Euro and the Schengen, either Scotland would have to commit to doing that eventually, or it will need to get an opt-out. And even if you don't have passport controls, look at the problem with taking pets to Northern Ireland at the moment. And one point, I'm sure we'll discuss borders more because there's several points I could make on borders. But I think if you're trying to look at how an independent Scotland and the EU would relate to England and Wales, look at how the UK currently relates to Ireland, not Northern Ireland. So its relationship with Ireland is determined by the EU-UK trade deal, but also by being in the common travel area. So it makes some things a little bit easier than, say, with France or Germany or the other EU 26. But that's what you should be looking at to see what the issues are going to be.
Thanks. Let's go on this border with England issue. You've raised it, Kirsty. It's come up in questions. We saw some questions flashing up there. Another one here from Patricia Henderson. Thanks for your question, Patricia. Saying, do the arrangements for cross-border trade which exist between EU member countries and their non-EU neighbours, such as between Sweden and Norway, we had that mentioned by Graham, or Belarus and Poland, provide solutions to what she says are the much-hyped problems forecast for the land border between an independent Scotland and England? Graham, could it be sorted, do you think? Or would there be, as the critics of independence say, would it be the Northern Ireland Protocol times 100?
No, I like the others. I don't think one should compare the Scottish case too much with the Northern Ireland case. They're quite different. Plainly, non-EU countries trade with the EU with a well-tried system of border controls. The problem in the case of Scottish independence is, well, there haven't been border controls with the English border for I don't know how long, if ever they were. But there are technical solutions. We will have time, you will have time to sort them out. For example, some people have said, well, Scotland's exports to other members of the European Union, most of them go through England, and they will have to continue to go through England. Well, that's not a big problem. For decades, there's been a very effective system of TIR plates on lorries, which go through one country and into another. So I think the border problems can be solved. But the question is, to what extent will the existence of the border, which causes, of course, some delays, and also the existence of border charges, which can also come in, to what extent will that disadvantage Scotland's economy? And that's a difficult economic analysis.
Philip, you're nodding your head there. Philip, then Kirsty.
Well, we have very direct experience of this now. We're living through it, the impact of the creation of a new border, because that's what we've got between the UK and the EU. And you look at the analysis, all the economic analysis that has been done most recently by the Office of Budget Responsibility, so UK government's own independent advisors on these things, saying that the impact of that border will hit UK GDP by about 4% in the medium term. And that is, why is that? So of course, trade continues, but trade essentially is more expensive because of all of the checks that you have to put in place, customs declarations, rules of origin, security declarations, export health certificates and all the rest. HMRC estimate that the cost of the UK-EU border on an annual basis amounts to something like £15 billion. That's a deadweight cost. There's no economic benefit in that. Somebody has to pay for it. Ultimately, it's the consumers in the UK that will pay for that. So you can extrapolate from that experience to put in a border between the UK, between the remainder UK and an independent Scotland. The point that economists have made about that, of course, is that because of the greater degree of integration of that trade over 300 years, effectively, that the economic impact could be greater than that of the creation of the EU-UK border. So it is a concern, and of course there are ways of mitigating those border impacts. But don't forget, there was a huge amount of work being done over the last 4 or 5 years to try and find a sort of magic border that would operate remotely with technology that wouldn't have all of these impacts. And believe me, a lot of work went into that. And that was going to be the solution.
I hear you, Philip. I hear you.
Well, you can hear the pain, can't you? But it wouldn't have required the Northern Ireland Protocol. But there is no border in the world that operates in that way. Some are more efficient than others, absolutely. Norway, Sweden is a very efficient border, but nevertheless, you still require those checks, and that is what ultimately causes cost.
Philip, thanks. Kirsty, then Graham, you were both keen to come in. I saw hands raised. Kirsty, then Graham.
Well, I disagree with quite a bit of what Philip has just said, because yes, there will be a border, especially for goods, and yes, that will have costs and economic impact compared to if the rest of the UK was also still in the European Union. But it's not identical to Brexit for a number of reasons. First of all, some of the technical solutions that were rejected for the Irish border and Northern Ireland related to some of the challenges around the peace process and the sensitivity of having any sort of even cameras on the border and that sort of thing, which I think would be less sensitive politically between Scotland and England. But the big difference here is that if Scotland was independent and so gaining or regaining sovereignty, it would also be opening its border to the EU and then putting some barriers up to the rest of the UK. Now, Philip said earlier, rightly, that currently Scotland's trade with the rest of the UK is higher than it is with the European Union. But there is a dynamic and a transitional process here. If Scotland were back in the European Union, it might be very attractive to foreign direct investment. If it was in the common travel area as well, which we've all said is quite likely, you're going to get benefits of free movement within the UK, free movement within the EU. Scotland's economy has benefited a lot from migration. And one last point here. When you actually look at the detail, and Northern Ireland has certainly shown that's true, you have to see what is trying to cross the border, what is going to be difficult. It's absolutely fascinating and a core point, I think, that Scotland exports almost as many manufacturing goods to the EU's single market as it does to the rest of the UK. So economically, you're going to put some costly barriers on manufacturing goods to the rest of the UK, but you're going to take away the same amount to the EU. So the real challenge is in services. Most of Scotland's trade with the UK is services, and that's very
financial
tricky.
Services, etc. Yeah.
That's really tricky. It might be helped a bit by being in the common travel area, but as you know, it wasn't dealt with in any great depth in the EU-UK trade agreement.
Kirsty, thanks. Graham Avery.
Another big problem resulting from Brexit, which we're still suffering from, is the animal and plant health rules, which now apply to British exports to the EU and indeed for British exports to Northern Ireland. Now, I'm quite optimistic that there will be a deal on the Northern Ireland Protocol in which the UK will accept to apply a large part, if not all, of the EU's animal and plant health rules. It's the only intelligent way to solve these border problems. And if that was the case, then that would greatly simplify matters for Scottish farmers and fishermen.
Thanks very much for that. I'm going to put a fundamental question to it. That's a good question. Peter H. Does the panel feel the debate over Scottish membership of the EU might lead to a renewed debate in England. Goodness me, that's fun. You could go back to the department, Philip, and try and sort it all out again, but in reverse. That's a good question. What do you make of that one, Philip?
Again, these are great questions, and that's a fascinating one. My own view on this is that Brexit isn't going to be reversed anytime soon.
No, we now have Keir Starmer saying that Labour wouldn't reverse it as well. So.
No, and I think politically that's just pretty much impossible, and a big trap for Labour if they pushed into that direction. That because Brexit is one of the few things I think that unites that rather disparate coalition that's got behind the current Conservative government. So, and clearly the Conservative government we have now is not that interested in ameliorating the disadvantages of Brexit. I hear what Graham says. It is a sensible thing to do to essentially align with the EU's phytosanitary requirements, but the government has resisted that, and where it's going is almost divergence for divergence sake to make it more difficult for the UK ultimately to go back in. So I think this debate in the UK as a whole, as long as it all stays together, but in England in particular, is going to unfold over quite a period of time. The economic logic, the cultural logic, the security logic says that we will rebuild a closer relationship with the EU over time. But I think that process will extend 10, 15, 20 years. We may ultimately go back in, but that is on a fairly distant horizon. All of the logic says that the UK has to stay closely aligned with its near neighbours. We're not going to be towed off into the Atlantic somewhere. And that logic will reassert itself, but it's going to take a political generation to do that.
I'm trying. I just stay with you on the. Oh yeah, you note in your article. It would not be in our UK, the remainder of UK interest. It would be in our UK's interest to strike a trade deal with Scotland. Or might the British state, as you note, prove obtuse enough to shoot itself in the foot? I love that expression.
Well, I mean, this is and I can relate.
Comment, by the way, upon the politics of it, but please carry on.
Yeah, I've got a personal experience of this when I was working in the UK government around the time of the 2014 referendum. When briefly towards the end of that campaign, obviously the polls were showing, one poll in particular showing, yes, we're ahead. We did briefly look into how would we negotiate with the independence deal with Scotland? And folk around the table say, oh, well, we would have to hit them with this and hit them with the other. And my point was to say, look, if Scotland were to be independent, it would be the remainder UK's closest and most important neighbour. And it would be in the interest of the remainder UK to have a good relationship with a prosperous Scotland. So the notion that a UK government would set off on a sort of a punishment expedition after a vote for independence, I thought was morally, but economically and all the rest of it, wrong. Now, my point in the article was, of course, that although what I'm saying is rational and logical and also the right moral case, it seems to me, that we have had demonstrations of the UK government that has been prepared to act in a way that self-evident isn't in the economic interests of the country. So that, you can never say no, can you?
Graham, let me generalise it to all of you. But a question from Graham Donovan: If as the SNP have told us, Brexit is a financial disaster for Scotland, then Graham asks, isn't Scottish independence would not Scottish independence be the same or worse? How could it not be? Graham, that's a point that is kind of the core point put by the unionists, although they find it, the Conservative Party find it rather difficult because, of course, they advocated Brexit and are arguing that ultimately, or their leaders are arguing that ultimately it'll be a success.
Look, I don't think if Scotland becomes independent and joins the European Union, it's not going to be an overnight financial disaster. Okay. That kind of thing was said about Brexit, but it didn't happen like that. These things take a period of years to develop. And on that point, I want to say I agree with Philip that as far as the England or the UK rejoining the European Union, in the short term, that's off the table. After all, we have in the short term a government at Westminster, which it's mainly ideological. But wait for the medium and long term. The younger generation are growing up, and they will have some other ideas.
Well, can I just come in on that?
Please. Yes, please. Yes, please.
Because it seems to me, I think the 20-year thing is right, but only in the sense that I don't think the EU would want the UK back in before 20 years. The first thing, I have actually asked people in different EU member states about this for a piece of research I did, and in 2 years' time, there's a general election in the UK. What happens if Starmer gets in? What sort of closer relationship might he negotiate? How might the politics change? But I think an independent Scotland would be welcomed back in the EU. That doesn't mean the EU would welcome the UK breaking up. It might be a bit of Schadenfreude after Brexit, but if you talk to people and governmental people in France or the Netherlands, they're not really wanting the UK to break up. We caused enough trouble as a state already, but there would be a lot of hesitation for a long time about bringing the UK back in. Whereas if tomorrow or 2 years tomorrow Scotland was independent, it's a small northern member state. It showed that it was pro-Remain in 2016. It's just, I asked someone about that a few years ago in Berlin, and someone quite senior in government. They said, it's just not a big deal. That doesn't mean there aren't some questions that are a big deal for Scotland. Although, the other question around, aren't the economics the same as Brexit? I mean, my earlier point was precisely not, because you're becoming a political, economic, social security, cultural member of a 500 million almost strong bloc.
Philip, a question on the common agricultural and fisheries policies. Presumably, if Scotland were to rejoin the EU, there'd be no escaping those. Maybe we wouldn't want to escape them, but we reckon we don't have to join the currency. I'm going to talk about that in a minute. But the CAP and the CFP would be back in. Is that right?
I don't see any scope for Scotland to opt out of either of those. I think the CAP has evolved hugely since I was involved with it, both in Brussels as it happens and in Scotland, and is shifting slowly to something that's a little bit more economically, environmentally rational than it used to be. CFP, Common Fisheries Policy, I think is a different equation. I think that would be difficult. And the SNP has said that at one point it would seek to rejoin, but not to go back into the CFP, Common Fisheries Policy. And given the importance of fisheries, as we've seen from Brexit to a number of EU member states, I think Scotland would have to go back into the CFP again. CFP is not a complete disaster. Of course, you could improve it. And ultimately, it's in everybody's interest to have a common fisheries policy that actually works to sustain the fisheries for the long term. But that is something that Scotland would have to reconcile itself to going back into the CFP, and there would be some pain in that, no doubt.
Thanks very much. Graham, you were keen to come in.
Yeah, on agriculture, I just want to say that we're now seeing the development of a new agricultural policy piloted by Westminster. Don't know quite what it's going to mean in Scotland, but it's pretty clear to me that most of what is said about this new agricultural policy could have been done if Britain was still a member of the European Union. One of the important changes which Westminster is now bringing in is limits on payments to individual big farms. Well, that couldn't be done years ago, except that Britain as a member refused to accept it. I think the change to environment-friendly practices, to paying farmers to protect the environment, the EU is going very fast in that direction. As far as fisheries is concerned, well, I repeat what I said, which is that Scotland as a member state would have a seat in the annual decisions on fisheries quotas. It would be in a better position than it now is, because Scotland doesn't have its own seat. I'm sorry, better position than it was in the past compared to it is now. I'm not saying that the result will be a paradise, but Scottish fishermen and the Scottish government would have better control over these annual quotas and regulations than they do now.
Right. I promised currency. Let's turn to currency. Currency was a huge issue in 2014. It's just a lasting issue on this subject of the constitutional future of Scotland and the UK. Thanks very much indeed for those questions. One there from Benjamin Harrop on the euro, on the currency. Indeed. Thanks for that, Benjamin. I'm going to go to let's keep Benjamin's question in mind, and let's think of Robert Crombie's question as well. Could Westminster refuse to allow Scotland, presumably he means an independent Scotland, it does, of course, to use the pound sterling, and if so, what would happen? Anybody? Philip, what good? Well, Kirsty, you were raising a hand. Philip first, then Kirsty, please.
Yeah, I mean, very briefly on that. So, Scotland could use any currency in the world if it wished, as a sort of a means of transaction. But the key question is whether the UK government would allow Scotland to be in a currency union, a formal currency union. And that's what the UK government said in 2014 it would not allow, and that would be, and would the government of an independent Scotland wish to be in a formal currency union? Would it go for so-called sterlingisation, using sterling as a currency of convenience pro tem? These are big issues, and there is no reason why Scotland shouldn't continue to use the pound. As I say, the key question is whether it would be in a currency union with the rest of the UK.
Kirsty, then Graham.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of confusion about the currency question, and especially vis-a-vis the European Union. Obviously, it's both an important political, social issue, and it's important, especially in the early years, for what impact a different currency will have on Scotland's economy. But I think to join the EU, Graham said 3 to 4 years. I would say 4 to 5. We're not far apart on how quickly it might go.
That's 4 to 5 post-independence. We can't even apply.
Yes, 4 to 5 post-independence.
Yeah.
So if SNP currency policy currently says we'll go for sterlingisation and then we'll move to a Scottish currency, well, if you've done that within 4 to 5 years, well, you just join the EU if you meet all the other criteria, like any other member state would. And if you hadn't done that in 4 to 5 years, I think there's an interesting question. It's unprecedented, but that doesn't mean you couldn't have a discussion with the EU about it. Could you say to the EU, well, we want to stay in with the pound for another 2 or 3 or 4 years, either because we'll go straight to joining the euro, or because it's going to take us another 2 or 3 years to introduce.
But critically, you don't think there would be an insistence on Scotland adopting the euro from day one of EU membership? Kirsty, then Graham.
There will have to be a commitment to it, and
okay.
What an independent Scotland mustn't and shouldn't do is make the mistake so many British prime ministers have, and say one thing in Brussels and another thing in London and Edinburgh, and assume nobody's listening. They won't want to bring in a small, difficult, like the UK country. And I also think we're very negative about this. Ireland joined the euro, Finland joined the euro. They wanted to be core players in the EU, and Sweden and Denmark are still influential, but nonetheless they're in that non-euro group. But it is true that if you come in with your own currency, you cannot be made to join the euro. Okay.
Graham Avery, you were keen to come in.
No, I just wanted to say, Kirsty, you know very well that the EU has never made anyone join the euro. You can't make them do it. They don't even have to have an opt-out. Sweden has never had an opt-out. It doesn't apply to the euro because it's not yet ready to do it. So let me just say very clearly, Scotland will only join the euro when and if it thinks it's in its national interest to do so. End of story.
But it could be very much in its interest, because you're going to have a discussion about what happens to a Scottish currency. Will it be weak? Will it be damaging to the independent Scottish economy? If Scotland joined the euro very fast, then that's not going to be weak vis-a-vis the pound sterling. So, the potential positives of being in the euro just don't seem to be part of that debate on the side of those who are pro-independence. And I think that's a gap.
Philip, you were keen to come in.
Yeah, I wouldn't dispute potential positives around joining the euro, but clearly not seen as a politically attractive proposition, which is why I suspect the SNP don't push it harder. All the arguments about currency, and essentially the underpinning of this is the fact that independent Scotland would be carrying a significant both current account deficit in terms of its trade balance and also a significant fiscal deficit. And Kirsty spoke earlier on about transition issues. Of course, you could argue these would be transitional issues, but they would be really, really big transitional issues and would have a huge, the way that Scotland approached the currency issue would be hugely important to the short-term economic prospects, and those would be driven by these twin deficits. And so an independent Scotland, in order to get to a point of stability, would have to deal with both of those things. So this would be a very, very tough transition. And not to say that Scotland wouldn't get there eventually and find that prosperous space, but I think one of the things that I would look for in the debate is honesty about the scale of the issues that would be faced, and then people can make their choices as their right to do so based on that solid information about what those challenges look like.
Let me just quote you a line from Keith McDonald's question. Keith, thanks for that. He goes on about the business of the union with the UK, trade with the UK, trade with the EU, and he asks, how can it be honest to promise people that both relationships can be negotiated quickly and easily? In a comparable tone, maybe put to you, Kirsty, Ian Lakin's question on currency. He says, given Brexit, given our current fiscal deficit, the fact we will be outside the EU and the UK internal market for what he calls an indeterminate period, we've discussed that. He says, how realistic would it be for Scotland to launch its own currency? We've discussed that, I know, but Kirsty, what's your take on that question?
I think that period, we could debate whether Graham's right, it's as short as 3 or 4 years, or whether it might take 10 years. Frankly, independence is going to be a big thing, and for hundreds of years, presumably. So whether you get into the EU in 5 years or 10 years is maybe not such a big deal. But the question is how, and it's a really important question, how does Scotland survive in that intermediate period? Now, the normal route, as Graham can tell you even better than me, is that a candidate country to join the EU would have a trade and association agreement with the EU that will unlock some financial support, some access to the single market, and so on and so forth. I think there might be a trick to learn from Brexit here, and that would actually be to have a transition period where you stayed in the UK market, stayed part of the UK-EU trade deal, wherever it had got to. That's what happened, for the first year after we left the EU. We were still in the customs union and the single market. So I think there are various ways through that. I did spend the first half of my career as an economist. I'm not a central bank expert, but I've talked to more than one, and what they said to me was, ideally, you might take 2 to 3 years to set up a perfect central bank, but if you needed to do it in 12 months, you could do it in 12 months. And I just wanted to pick up Philip's point about honesty. Of course, we want honesty, but also we're talking about the future here and the economic future here. So I would like not just to see a good, and there is quite a debate around the fiscal deficit and how large it might be, or whether it would be very large. And after COVID and the accumulation of debt, that's an even more tricky question. But I think, there will be different scenarios. What about an optimistic scenario where there's a lot of foreign direct investment, a lower deficit, benefits of migration, and then a less good scenario where there's a more pessimistic take on all that? And I haven't seen the SNP or the Scottish Government put those sorts of scenarios into the public domain. So that's where you really get into the nitty-gritty, I think.
Okay, I'm going to ask you, we're running out of time, I'm going to ask you in a minute to take a broad picture of whether Brexit makes independence more or less likely, whether it's contributing. But one question I want to get in, it's not actually directly germane to the EU, but it does arise, Kirsty, from that point you make there about the allocation of costs and benefits that have to be on independence. Maybe put this to Philip or Graham. I'm not sure whoever wants to take this. Joseph O'Shea asks, what are the rights of Scottish pensioners, irrespective of their stand on independence? Having contributed NI payments for 40 plus years, one would expect that these are non-negotiable rights. Is that correct, Philip? I mean, this arose.
This is obviously a very live debate at the moment, and the SNP position in 2014 was quite clear that an independent Scotland state would take on those responsibilities for essentially the state pension for pensioners in Scotland. And I find it a little peculiar that the policy seems to change, because we all know that the pensions are funded out of the current account. There is no pot of money there.
I think the policy flickered for a moment and then went back to 2014.
Well, I just it's a bit of an odd one, that one. I think the honest position is that basically the taxpayers of the remainder of the United Kingdom are not going to pay for the pensions of an independent Scotland.
What would happen, presumably, is that there would be a share of the assets of the UK and the debts of the UK
and the liabilities, and that would
fits into those.
That would be argued through, but the notion there is a big, that all our NI contributions go into a big pot in, and unfortunately they don't. They go into sort of general taxation, which pays for stuff now. It's not all sort of salted away somewhere that you can somehow get access to. There are, of course, loads of assets that the British state holds, but the liabilities are rather bigger.
Okay, anybody else want to pile in on that one? I'm quite keen to go to a more general. Yeah, Kirsty, yeah, please.
Yeah, just briefly. I mean, all these questions about assets and debts and so on are, sensitive and complicated. But I think one thing that's made it more complicated is the pandemic, because I think there is quite a strong argument to be made that the UK government mismanaged the economics of the pandemic, not least, the billions it spent on test and trace system, when in countries like Germany, they cost a tiny bit of that. So post-pandemic, other big countries also have got much higher levels of debt. Is it a fair thing that if Scotland was independent in 2 or 3 years' time, what does a fair share mean post-pandemic? And I haven't seen that discussed much, but actually, if we got closer to the reality of that, it might be.
Let's go to that final question that I promised then, which is along the lines of, does Brexit, the existence of Brexit, the fact of Brexit, when the facts change, I change my mind, the fact of Brexit, does it make independence more or less likely, more or less attractive? That's you've given analysis so far. This is asking for perhaps an analytical opinion, which is a bit cheeky of me, but hey, it's part of my charm. Kirsty, what's your take on that? More or less likely?
I mean, obviously, it does in both directions, but overall, I think it makes it more likely, because I think it adds to the divergence between Scotland and England, and I think that divergence is coming for other reasons, also to do with 20 plus years of devolution. But I think it makes it more likely. The
divergence being that Scotland voted 62% in favour of remaining, and while England voted to leave.
Yes, I think that Scotland. England is going through an identity crisis. It's become a more divided and more nationalist country. It's not recognisable comparing it with how it looked 30 years ago. I think Scotland looks like a more normal North European country, and so I think the Remain vote, the wish for self-determination, the problems of asymmetry in whatever system you come up with, of devolution, Gordon Brown's plans for Keir Starmer. I think there is a real problem of things like Devo Max as an alternative to independence when you haven't got the rest of the UK and the European Union.
Devo Max is one of the issues that will be looked at in this very series, which of course will be a prolonged and detailed look at Scotland's future. Graham Avery, does Brexit make independence more or less likely, more or less attractive?
Look, I'm not Scottish, I'm not in Scotland, so I'm not going to predict anything about how the Scots will vote.
Folk in Scotland don't like the predictions either. Very, very wise.
Okay. But having passed on that, I want to say just 2 more things.
Yeah.
First of all, if and when Scotland seriously discusses joining the European Union, I do think the point that somebody made about having a good, serious argument is of absolute importance. We saw how nonsensical the Brexit debate was, and I hope that everyone, including the Scottish government, will contribute in a useful way to such a debate. Not least, the Herald should be contributing to it, and already is, by having this series. Finally, I'm going to disagree with Kirsty. I don't often do that, but she talked about 10 years to join the European Union. No, I think
no, I don't think so. I said some people think that. I think 45.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right, well, I don't, and I think that's far too long.
Okay, Philip Rycroft, more or less attractive, more or less appealing.
So I'll end where I started. I said in my introduction, I think Brexit does make independence more likely because of that reinforcing, as Kirsty said, of that sense of a separate political community in Scotland. I think the evidence is there that the uptick in the polls from what was 45% that sort of persisted for quite a while after the 2014 referendum has been pretty consistently around the 50% mark, I think is ascribable to Brexit. I'm slightly surprised, to be honest, that it hasn't gone further than that, given the vote, 62% you said in favour of staying in the EU and Scotland. So I think that dynamic, and if you align that with the demographic of the younger folk in Scotland being more inclined to vote for independence, younger folk across the UK being more inclined to want to be part of the EU, I think that dynamic will continue to play out for some time. But as I said at the start, undoubtedly Brexit makes the prospect of independence more complicated because you have to deal with this question of two markets, the UK internal market, the EU single market, and Scotland would face a choice between those two things. And that is a hard choice, and it is a choice with consequences. And of course, Kirsty would say, well, those consequences would come out of the system over time. That might well be the case, but that coming out of the system would economically, I think, take 15, 20 years or more. And that for most of us, though, the future is a very long time. For most of us, that's quite a lot of our future. So it needs careful thought.
Many, many thanks to all the contributors. That was absolutely superb. Huge thanks as well to our subscribers who submitted questions. I'm sorry I wasn't able to get to all of them, but they were absolutely tremendous. Really excellent session of questions and great answers from our contributors. Thanks for their articles. Thanks especially for their contribution to this discourse tonight. And I'm going to draw that to a close with au revoir, auf Wiedersehen, arrivederci, toodaloo the new.